Well, hello everyone again, and thank you so much for being here. My name is Lance. This is The Gathering. This is where you get to hear a steady speaker hum with my voice over it occasionally. So I hope it's not nearly as distracting to you out there as it is to me up here. But I want to let you know that we are completing a very special time together. For 7 weeks, we've been focusing on the book of Revelation, one of the most easily misunderstood, easily confused. Oh, Lord have mercy. Thank you, Ian. You're the man. Here are our prayers. I didn't mean to be so passive-aggressive in mentioning that. Now I feel bad. I just thought it was something that was broken. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate it. So we've been finishing the book of Revelation. We've gone through it. We spent 7 weeks. 7 is a very important number and concept in the book of Revelation. I'll be sending out a summary over the course of email this week if you've missed some of the messages. I think what you'll have experienced if you've been with us for this entire 7 weeks is that while there's a lot that we can better understand about Revelation when we peel apart some of the layers and the imagery and the context, there's a lot of really solid elements we can get, but there's also so much more to learn. Am I right? It's so much deeper to go. These 7 weeks haven't been nearly enough, but I hope more than anything I've helped to demystify that work a little bit, make it a little bit less scary, make it a little bit less condemning, and hopefully make it a much more helpful and constructive part of following Jesus in your life. So before we get to that, I want to take a few minutes and acknowledge some of the baggage that I'm bringing to the table this morning, because it's going to influence the way that I kind of lead and guide us through this last portion of Revelation. And the first is, so this is called like your hermeneutical lens, right? Your hermeneutical lens is the way that you approach the text and feel like it needs to be explained or expounded upon to your community. And so two things are really influencing my hermeneutics today. And one of them is my wife signed us up to dog sit this weekend. Very unclear communication. We thought we were dog sitting for one day. That's not the case, we found out. Late. So we signed up to dog sit, and so we're dog sitting, and we haven't had a dog for about 2 years. Ours passed away a couple years ago. He's old. And in fact, he spent the majority of his life being old. He spent the majority of his life being old and fat. And so I thought that I was a good dog owner, but it turns out I was just a good dog owner for old and fat dogs. And our next door neighbor's dog is being, my next door neighbors are like 25 and like alive with youth, and their dog is not an old and fat dog. Their dog is like this Olympic athlete dog. And so my wife and I both work in church, and so this dog's going to be like alone for a lot of today. And so we needed to go for a walk this morning, like a not like my kind of walk, like an Olympic athlete walk. And so we're out walking at 5 o'clock in the morning this morning. And we're walking, so we're walking and walking and walking, and I'm walking this dog, and one of the things I've shared over and over again is that my personal discipline of prayer isn't very well served by sitting quietly with like a throw blanket and a cup of chamomile tea. I don't want to shock you, but that's not really my personality. And so what actually works the best for me is prayer while walking, right? And that's a habit that I have. I like to get out in the morning and walk, and I pray that way. And so, but what's happening is this walk is a lot longer than my normal walks. Do you understand? This is not a normal walk. And so I'm at like mile 8 of my 5 a.m. morning walk with this Olympic athlete dog. And I'm praying, and my prayer list has I've already kind of run through it, but I've still got like 6 miles of walk left to go. And so I'm walking and I'm praying. And so, what happens is I'm starting to kind of pray more deeply, right? I'm starting to pray more, a more heavy engagement with prayer. And I'm in one of those seasons of life right now that's kind of nice. If y'all gone through those, or hopefully you're experiencing one right now where things are not super dramatic, and your ship is sailing pretty much on the course you want it to, and a lot of your immediate family is happy and healthy, and you're just in one of those good seasons. We've had not so good seasons, and we're in a good season right now. So I'm really lifting up and celebrating that a lot when I'm talking to God. But at the same time, I'm living with my heart wide open, and I'm deeply connected in a bigger community. And so I'm aware of a lot of you, right, who are not going through that season right now, who are going through a very different kind of season. And the same thing's happening in my life. The same things, I'm going through a lot of you guys in my family who are going through a difficult time, right now. And I'm praying, and I'm praying more deeply than I've been praying in my normal habit because I'm on like mile 14 of this walk, and it's 4:15 in the morning, and so I'm praying and I'm walking, and all of a sudden I get to this deeper point in prayer where I really start like letting into my heart a lot of what's going on in your lives and your families and my own families, my extended family and their life. And immediately it's like something happens in me emotionally and spiritually where I like touch something that I had been avoiding, and I immediately start to emote. I'm like, it's 3:45 in the morning and I'm on mile 26 of this walk this morning, today, and I'm like sobbing. I'm this weird man walking down the street just bawling with a dog who does not respect his authority or leadership. And that just hit me this morning, right? And it's not even my own life, and it's other people, it's you guys. And you remember that imagery that we had about the week 3 of this series where the faithful that are under the throne, that are experiencing all this suffering, are calling out to God, how much longer, oh God? How much longer? These people who have suffered and died or experienced this world of illness and loss, how much longer, oh God? And so I'm on mile 32 of my walk at 2:15 in the morning, and I'm just, how much longer, oh God, is me this morning? So that's one thing. It's really affecting the way that I'm experiencing this text today. And the other thing that's really kind of moving in me hermeneutically is we have a Bible study here on Wednesday nights. I lead it. It's called Pastor's Bible Study. We've been in the Gospel of Matthew for a really long time because I go slow. And we're in the Gospel of Matthew. And one of the things that really influences the way I interpret the Gospel of Matthew and the Christian Gospels in particular and the entirety of the Christian message as a whole is this little fact that just kind of really sunk into me one day, and I have a hard time letting it go. So in your seat, if you don't have one with you, this is a New Testament. This is yours to keep, by the way, if you would so like. It's like 90 cents. I got a million. Take them. If you don't have a good little New Testament, take it with you or give it to somebody. But I give a lot of these away, right? And so I have these, and if you would with me, just kind of turn, open the first couple pages. There's like the material about it, the welcome, the contents, some scriptures for some specific times in your life, a 90-day reading plan, and then some information about it. And then pretty quickly, you're all of a sudden reading the Gospel of Matthew, page 1. And the Gospel of Matthew begins with this genealogy of Jesus, and then story about his birth, and then the coming of the Magi. We then have his escape into Egypt, the return from Egypt, ministry of John the Baptist, the baptism of Jesus, the temptation of Jesus in the desert, and then his return. And here on page 3, we're just like 2 pages in on the right side, right here at the bottom, chapter 4, verse 17, we have Jesus for the very first time in the Christian if you were to read the New Testament like a book, which is not necessarily how it's supposed to be read, but that's how a lot of people do, this is the first time Jesus is actually proclaiming a public message, right? Think of all that he has to teach, all that he has to say, all that he has to explain in such a short time to do it in. This is the very first time that Jesus is proclaiming a message for public consumption, right? This is Jesus, the prophet, Jesus, God incarnate, Jesus, the teacher, Jesus, the rabbi. He's come to teach and to lead and to heal. And the very first thing that he says is in chapter 4, verse 17. From that time, Jesus began to announce, change your hearts and lives. Here comes the kingdom of heaven. Change your hearts and lives. Here comes the kingdom of heaven. Think of all the things that he could have said, right? All the things that he needed to say, all the things that needed to be explained or understood. But he starts with, change your hearts and lives. Here comes the kingdom of heaven. That really influences the way that I read the New Testament, right? And the way that I read the Old Testament, the way that I read the Christian narrative, and the way that I understand myself as a follower of Jesus in the world. That the very first thing he has to say to the world that so desperately needs his message is, change your hearts and lives. Here comes the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so those are the 2 things that are really influencing me today. I hope it'll make sense by the end. If not, you get what you pay for, and this is free. So it's funnier in my head every time. So I want to recap a little bit our story, and that is the story of the book of Revelation. It comes out of a context, right? And so Jesus is born approximately the year 0 CE. He is crucified, dies, and is resurrected somewhere around 33 to 35 CE by most accounts, right? Roughly somewhere in there, 33 to 35 CE. Immediately after his life, death, and resurrection, a group of his followers, empowered by the Holy Spirit, received at Pentecost, begin to go out into the world, right? Proclaim his message, share his gospel, be his disciples, his apostles, his leaders in the world, bring this good news, right? God is with us. God is for us. God offers salvation to us through Jesus Christ. All of these rules and regulations that you thought you understood, all these images of petty and vile gods that you thought were in control is not the real story. This is the good news. Hear it and be a part of it. They go out and they begin to lead and they begin to form communities and baptize and build up the church, right? And at the same time, there's a number of leaders who are communicating about the best way to do this, and they're guiding communities that get it right in some ways and wrong in other ways. And so what has happened around about 60 years later, approximately the time 95 CE or AD, around about the year 95, there is a community, a number of communities that are located in what we now call Turkey, right? It's a Roman province called Asia. It's now called Turkey. There's a number of cities in that area that are very metropolitan, right? They're very economically interesting. There's a lot of stuff going on. These are the kinds of cities that would have basketball teams, NBA teams today, right? Professional sports teams, because there's a lot going on. They're very metropolitan. They're very urban. Lots of commerce is going on through there, lots of trade, lots of people from different backgrounds and different experiences, and part of those very diverse communities are small groups of Christian people. Right? They're the churches in these 7 cities. And when we think church, don't think like First Methodist with a big building. Think more like a home-based small group, right? But these small groups of baptized Christians. And these baptized Christians don't have a full and codified New Testament like we do today, right? Instead, they have the teachings and the lessons that have been passed on to them. And then they have a number of different teachers who are coming through their communities and leading, right? And over time, a number of teachers have come into these communities and have began to give messages along the lines of, we understand that you're in the middle of these big fancy cities with all this money and all of these opportunities, and there's a lot of different influences on you. And some of those influences are things like, hey, come to this temple and make certain sacrifices so you can participate financially in the work of the city. Or, hey, honor this God or this so-and-so so you can participate in the life of the city. Or all these other different things. If you want to buy or sell land, you have to go do it through the temple, right? Paying homage to these other gods in order to be a part of the civic life of the community. And these other teachers are coming through and telling these new Christians, yeah, that's fine. Don't worry about it, all right? You can go along to get along. Don't stick your head up too much. It's totally cool. Don't worry about it, all right? We know it doesn't really mean anything. Oh, it's not a real God. Don't worry about it. These teachers are teaching this message. Meanwhile, on the island of Patmos, it's like this little Galveston-like island right off the coast, there's this teacher, prophet, visionary, seer named John of Patmos. And he's familiar with these cities. We don't know exactly how, but he knows what's going on in them, and he has a message for them. He needs them to change. He needs them to understand themselves and the world fundamentally differently, right? He has a message for them. He has a prophecy for them. They need to understand something. So he writes them a letter with an urgent message in a genre called apocalypse, which has all these different ways of using images to help us better understand what's going on in the background. The word apocalypse is a transliteration of apocalypsis. It means a revealing. So the question is, what does Revelation reveal to us? Right? Chapter 1. John reveals to us that Christ is in the center of the world. He's telling these 7 cities who have somehow believed that participating in all these other actions is okay. Do you realize that Christ holds you in his hands today? He is the center today. He is present today. Do you understand how central Jesus is today? In chapters 2 and 3, he delivers a message to each of them. To each of these 7 churches, he writes a little letter specifically to them and what they have going on in their community. There's different messages. They hit on different topics, but always on the same theme, and that is you are accommodating too much to the world around you because it's easy. Okay? You're just going along to get along. You're just trying to fit in, and in doing so, you are falling away from the path that Christ has called you to. You're trying to take on all the good aspects of this wonderful gospel, but in doing so just justify the life you already want to lead. Right? And other teachers specifically have told you that that's totally cool. John says to them. And it could end there, right? Nice short letter. But John says, let me really explain to you why this is so life and death. It's not just about your participation in this particular practice. It's just not about whether you go to the temple for these land transactions. It's about something much more vital. Let me show you why this is so urgent. And that's what the entire remainder of the book of Revelation is about. Chapters 4 and 5. He gives us an image. He reveals to us what's really going on, that at the center of everything is God, the Creator, seated on the throne. All of creation worships God and sings God's name because God is the Creator of the good world and everything in it. And seated next to God is Jesus, the Lamb who was slain and yet stands. The Lamb who was killed and yet is yet triumphant. The one who the shedding of his blood reconciles all of us back to God. That is what's actually at the center of the world. Remember that, John says. Anything else is false worship. The only thing worthy of worship, the only thing worthy of being placed at the center of your life is them, he says. And he goes on to reveal in chapters 6 and 7, look at all this terrible stuff that's being wrought in the world, all of these wars, all of this violence, all of this economic unfairness, all of this injustice. This is God allowing the sinful consequences of the world to play out, right? And yes, it is terrible. And yes, it is difficult. And yes, there is suffering. Those are the consequences of the world's sinful choices, he says, and yet, people are still being saved. And yet, from the midst of that, people are still encountering Christ. And yet, in the midst of that, people are still discovering a reconciled relationship with God. God's answer to the people who are screaming out, "How much longer, O God?" is to show a vision of more and more people from the midst of this mess managing to come to the Christ who saves. In chapters 12 and 14, which we hit on last week, John goes on further because he's been just ripping into this culture, right? I mean, he is not a fan. He is not a supporter of the status quo in this community. But that doesn't make sense necessarily. Some of these people who reside in these cities, they're making really good money. To some of these people who reside in these cities, it seems like this empire must be awarded by God to have everything it's received, right? It seems to these people like this might even be God's chosen nation. Maybe God is working through this empire, right, for the reconciliation of the world. God's done that before. Maybe the most faithful thing we can do is put all of our time and energy into supporting this empire, right, into working along with it, into being part of its purposes in the world. Maybe that's what we should be doing. That's certainly what some of these teachers are telling us. So what John reveals in chapters 12 and 14 is he says, think of all the sinful characteristics you have in your life. Remember we did that last week? Think of all our universal human tendencies towards things like pride and to greed and to distrust and to hate and to violence. Do you realize that the very fabric of this empire, the very fabric of the culture you find yourself in is sinful? It pushes people into behaving that way. We're all struggling against these tendencies, and this culture just makes it worse. The reason, he says, is it's under control of the devil. This force that exists to separate people from God. I don't know how you describe it. I don't know how it works, but it has deep hooks into this society. Come out from it, he says. Come out from it, he says. You can't work with it. You can't work alongside it. You can't hope that it gets better. Remove yourself from it, John says. Which leads us up to this point today. All of this harsh rhetoric, all of these, John raises the stakes over and over again. John makes it really clear in this letter. This is life or death, he says. There is no compromise here. He is trying to make it clear, he's not trying to make it clear at all. He's trying to make it powerfully known that this is very important, right? This is life or death. This is imminent. This is important. Please listen. Please follow. Please change your hearts and lives, he says. And he doesn't end with a threat. Despite all of this, he doesn't end with an admonition. Despite all of this, he doesn't end with a conviction. He ends with a promise. That's what we're going to read today. It's in Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 through 8. Second to last page. Page 270. At the conclusion of this long work, with all of this revealing of negative things behind the scenes, of all of this revealing of opportunities to fall short, of all of this revealing of the different ways that people have lost the path, of all of this revealing of different ways that people are falling short, John ends with this, a promise. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the former heaven and the former earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne say, "Look, God's dwelling is here with humankind. He will dwell with them, and they will be his peoples. God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. There will be no mourning, crying, or pain anymore, for the former things have passed away." Then the one seated on the throne said, "Look, I'm making all things new." He also said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." Then he said to me, "All is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will freely give water from the life-giving spring. Those who emerge victorious will inherit these things. I will be their God, and they will be my sons and daughters. But for the cowardly, the faithless, the vile, the murderers, those who commit sexual immorality, those who use drugs and cast spells, the idolaters and all the liars, their share will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur. This is the second death." God speaks to us through the reading of Scripture. Thanks be to God. So in order to help unpack this a little bit, there's three main pieces I need us to get to. The first is this image of the New Jerusalem, right? So one of the biggest difficulties in interpreting Revelation is that it uses the genre of apocalypse, which by its very nature uses visual metaphor to reference things that are larger or different than what it necessarily says. I have no problem with you reading this literally, but I also want you to read it larger than literally. So for example, when he's talking about New Jerusalem, one, I think it's amazingly cool that we have this vision of this restored creation coming down from heaven rather than going up. It's the very opposite of what we experience so much in Revelation talk. It's not about getting raptured away. It's about having this new creation come forth here. So when he's writing about the New Jerusalem, when I was walking this morning and things had calmed down a little bit, I realized that there's a term for what he's doing. Does anybody remember the term synecdoche from high school English? Synecdoche? I need to email Ms. Wilson. You don't remember me, but I remember synecdoche. Synecdoche is a literary term that means using a part to represent the whole, right? It's like when someone has a car and you say like, "Hey, nice wheels," right? But what you're really talking about is, "Hey, nice car." That's a synecdoche. He's using a synecdoche here. He's using imagery. When he's calling the New Jerusalem, he's using Jerusalem as a stand-in for the people of Israel. And he's using the people of Israel as a stand-in for the new creation, the new humanity, the new restored humanity that dwells with God on earth. Do you understand? The new humanity that has been so transformed by God's work that the new heaven and the new earth have passed away. A new creation has burst forth. That is the descension of the New Jerusalem. That is the creation of the new and restored humanity that resides with God on earth. That is the vision that he has with us. It's not just some image of a magical city descending. It's the image of God dwelling with God's creation, perfectly restored, finally, perfectly worthy, finally, perfectly transformed. Finally, that is his image. In the text there, we have a description, the victorious. You might also have it conquering if you have a different translation. Those who are victorious, those who have conquered. One thing conquers in the book of Revelation. One thing conquers. One thing is victorious. That thing is Jesus, the Lamb who was slain but yet standing. Revelation points us over and over again to the thing that is ultimately victorious, the thing that is ultimately powerful, the thing that is so powerful that not only remakes the world but saves lives, saves our life, saves your life, is Jesus' self-sacrificial love. That is the source of the victory. That is what is victorious. So the victorious who dwell with God in the New Jerusalem, who are those who have finally come to understand and to claim that self-sacrificing love of Jesus. Does that make sense? Conquering here is not the smart. Conquering here is not the morally perfect who have put all sins behind them. Conquering here is not the ones who have been blessed with money or riches or power or authority or fame. Conquering here is the ones who have claimed and have come to understand that it is in Jesus' self-sacrificial love that God is remaking the world, and that makes them victorious. Their faithfulness to that brings them into the New Jerusalem. Their faithfulness to God's self-sacrificing love through Jesus Christ makes them part of this transformed and reconciled humanity. And the last thing, he gives us a list of characteristics, of traits that don't belong in this new and restored creation, that are done away with, that have no place here. Cowardice, faithlessness, vileness. I knew synecdoche, don't hold it against me. Murderers, those who commit sexual immorality, which remember is his reference toward idolatry. Those who use drugs and cast out spells, those sorcerers, the liars. All of this are things that are found in and celebrated by that kingdom of the world. Those are all hallmarks of what's going on in the world around them, right? These people who are idolaters, these people who are faithless, who refuse to follow Christ because it's inconvenient, these people who lie about their real commitments in order to get ahead. These are the things that don't belong anymore. These are the things that have been undone by Jesus' victorious works. These are the things that have no place in this perfect and reconciled humanity. That's gone. That's the old way. That's the old world. Something else is at hand now. That's the promise. That's what Revelation ends with. After all of this confusing language, after all these strong admonitions, it ends with good news. It ends with a promise. Be a part of it, John says. So that ends our 7-week relationship with Revelation in here. And so the question I have to ask is, why read Revelation? Like, why? It's really hard. And it's really easy to misunderstand, right? It's very difficult. And then when you do get it, it's difficult on what it challenges you to do and to be, right? So why read Revelation? People have been asking that question since the very beginning of its circulation amongst Christian communities, right? At every turn, church fathers and mothers have been looking at this work and say, what in the world do we do with this? Right? Since its very beginning, it has been one of the most polarizing texts in the Christian world. So many opportunities to lead people astray, so many opportunities to actually do damage rather than good, so many weapons placed in the hands of people who just want to judge or separate others. So what does it really do? And what is it all about? Revelation has two groups of people it's talking to. It has two groups of people that it's talking to in 2017 in Fort Worth, Texas. It has two groups of people. One is a group of people like me, who very easily and skillfully navigate the world. Right? Well, that didn't sound right, but the people who are at home in the status quo. Does that make sense? The people for whom the status quo is just fine. I'm one of those people. The people for whom going along to get along is a natural tendency. I am one of those people. The people for whom holding your head down and just fitting in and not making a big mess of things is perfectly natural and normal. Just being a part of the larger machine is a perfect fit for them. I'm one of those people. And Revelation calls to me and says, who taught you that? Who taught you that following Jesus was going to be so easy and cost so little? Who taught you that? Revelation speaks to people like me and saying, who are you putting at the center? What do you think is really behind everything? What do you think is really worthy of your praise and your worship? Revelation speaks to people like me. I'm probably not the only one. But Revelation also speaks to people like me, who are feeling crushed upon the wheel at times, who have deeply come to know and understand that God's work is love and mercy and compassion and justice, and yet still there is so much suffering and death. There is still so much evil. We hear God's good promises and we believe them, and still there is so much illness and death and loss that does not belong in God's good creation. There are still people just like me who cry out, "How much longer, O God?" And I'm probably not the only one. Revelation ends with a promise. But this whole long work of John is to a group of people who have fit in to this world in one way. And he's calling them to change. Maybe it's time for you to sacrifice more, or commit more, or to let God reside in the center of your life for the first time ever, it says. Maybe you need to change. Or maybe you need to realize that in the midst of all of this suffering and death that you experience personally or through others, that God is still saving. God is still working justice and mercy. That God's promises are still good. Maybe you need to change. But at the heart of everything, know that God's transforming work of creation is underway. That all things are being made new. That the new heaven and the new earth are coming. And you can be a part of it. At the heart of everything, John's story ends what Jesus started. Change your hearts and lives. Here comes the kingdom of heaven. Please pray with me. Loving God, encountering you through pieces of Holy Scripture sometimes brings more questions than answers. Sometimes it reveals things that comfort us, that give us strength for another day. Sometimes it reveals things that challenge us or even cause us to condemn ourselves. God, remind us that through this and all things, at the center of everything is you. The God who created the earth and called it good. The God who created people and called them good. The God that created each soul that hears this message and called them good. God, let us change our hearts and lives. Let us have a place in the kingdom of heaven that is coming on earth. God, as we do this in all things, allow us to follow in the example of your Son, Jesus the Christ, as we pray together the words that he taught us to pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.